As a one-time student and then teacher of academic economics, I think a bar graph measuring and comparing, for example, per capita national output in different countries. But the differential effect internationally of the death of communism cannot be understood in that way. We are confronted with different forms, not different levels, of post-Soviet ideology. Consider Russia in this respect. In explicating the concept of the, quote, death of communism, we frequently use the formulation that the former Soviet Union is viewed at best as a failed experiment. That is generally true in Western Europe and North America. It is less true in much of the Third World, and it is not true at all in Russia. Quite the opposite. The politically dominant section of the new Russian capitalist class, represented by Vladimir Putin, views the former Soviet Union as the most successful experiment ever, so to speak, of Russian-centered state building. In 2005, Putin declared that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the, quote, greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, quoted in Edward Lucas, The New Cold War, Putin's Russia, and the Threat to the West, 2008. I assume a similar attitude towards the former USSR, widespread throughout the Russian society at large. In the past few years, the Putin regime and the Russian elite more generally have sought to restore Stalin's historical reputation as the premier leader of a Russian-dominated world power in the 20th century. The Russian ambassador to NATO displays a picture of Stalin in his office. A popular TV show, quote, The Name of Russia, end quote, ranks Stalin as one of the country's 5 greatest historical figures in The Economist, 27 November 2008. In 2007, an officially sponsored educational guide, A Modern History of Russia, 1945-2006, a teacher's manual, compared Stalin favorably with Peter the Great. Quote, Stalin followed Peter the Great's logic, demand the impossible to get the maximum possible. It continues, quote, He, Stalin, is considered one of the most successful leaders of the USSR. The country's territory reached the boundaries of the former Russian Empire and in some cases even surpassed it. A victory in one of the greatest wars was won. Industrialization of the economy and cultural revolution took place successfully, resulting not only in mass education, but also in the best educational system in the world. The USSR became one of the leading countries in science. Unemployment was practically defeated. Quoted in Lucas, The New Cold War. Hardly a description of a failed experiment. In a way, it is more difficult for us to address the form taken by the death of communism in present-day Russia than in Western Europe or North America. In the latter countries, the former Soviet Union is still primarily identified with, quote, socialism, not, quote, Russian imperialism, end quote. Stalin is viewed and generally vilified as a disciple of Marx and Engels. In Russia, Stalin is viewed and frequently extolled as the successor of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. For many Russians, communism has not died because it never lived in the first place. Even before the severity of the current world economic downturn became evident last fall, free market triumphalism had ceased to be an important current in the climate of bourgeois opinion, even in the U.S. Today, prominent and respected spokesmen for American finance capital, such as former Federal Reserve leader Paul Volcker, foresee a deep and prolonged global downturn. Comparisons with the Great Depression of the 1930s are becoming commonplace. The Tory mayor of London commented that reading the London Financial Times these days is like spending time with a millennial suicide cult. Nevertheless, no current of bourgeois opinion is now concerned with the prospect of imminent social revolutions anywhere or the revival of mass communist parties claiming the Marxist-Leninist tradition. Of Ends and Means, a Historical Journey. In Chapter 5 of The State and Revolution, in the section on the higher phase of communist society, Lenin wrote, quote, "From the bourgeois point of view, it is easy to declare that such a social order is sheer utopia, and to sneer at the socialists for promising everyone the right to receive from society, without any control over the labor of the individual citizen, any quantity of truffles, cars, pianos, etc. Even to this day, most bourgeois savants confine themselves to sneering in this way, thereby betraying both their ignorance and their selfish defense of capitalism." By the term bourgeois savants, Lenin meant those intellectuals who avowedly supported and justified the capitalist economic system. He did not include in this category the ideological spokesman for the Socialist Second International, such as Karl Kautsky, who considered himself an orthodox Marxist. Whether by 1917-18, the right-wing leaders of the mass social democratic parties, for example, Friedrich Ebert in Germany, Albert Thomas in France, Emile van der Velde in Belgium, subjectively still believed in a future socialist society is another question. In all likelihood they did not, but neither did they publicly repudiate the traditional goal of the socialist movement as a utopian project. At the beginning of the German Revolution in November 1918, the centrist Independent Social Democratic Party presented a series of demands for a coalition government with the Social Democratic Party on the basis of the then existing Workers' and Soldiers' Council. The first of these was, Germany should be a socialist republic. To this, the SPD leadership responded, "This demand is the goal of our own policy. However, the people must decide on this through the Constituent Assembly." Quoted in John Rydell, editor of the German Revolution and the Debate on Soviet Power, Documents, 1918-1919, Preparing the Founding Congress. In attacking the Bolshevik Revolution and the nascent Communist International, the Social Democratic leaders primarily condemned the dictatorship of the proletariat as a violation of democracy, which they identified with parliamentary-type government elected by universal and equal suffrage. Here it is useful to look at Lenin's Moscow, a memoir written in the late 1940s, early 1950s by Trotsky's colleague and friend Alfred Rosner. Rosner had been an anarchist and then a leading revolutionary syndicalist intellectual in France before adhering to the newly formed Communist International. In his memoir, Rosner recounts the initial reaction to Lenin's The State and Revolution among both orthodox social democrats like Kautsky and Jean Longuet, Marx's grandson, and among anarchists. Quote, "It was an extraordinary book, and it had a strange destiny. Lenin, a Marxist and social democrat, was treated as an outcast by the theoreticians of the socialist parties which claimed to be Marxist. It isn't Marxism, they shrieked. It's a mixture of anarchism and blanquism." One of them even found a witty turn of phrase and called it blanquism with a sauce tartare. On the other hand, for revolutionaries situated outside the mainstream of orthodox Marxism, for the syndicalists and anarchists, this blanquism, sauce and all, was a pleasant revelation. They had never heard such language from the Marxists they knew. Louis-Auguste Blanqui, 1805 to 1881, was the last major representative of the Jacobin communist tradition that originated with Babeuf's conspiracy of equals in the latter days of the French Revolution. The Babeuvist conception of communism, developed in a pre-industrial society, was one of distribution and consumption rather than production and the overcoming of economic scarcity. However, in labeling Lenin a Blanquist, Kautsky, Longuet, et al. Were not referring to that aspect of the Jacobin communist outlook. By Lenin's Blanquism, they meant the insurrectionary overthrow of the capitalist state, organized and led by a revolutionary vanguard party. As Rosner pointed out, the State and Revolution was well received by many anarchists and syndicalists, some of whom thought that Lenin was moving from Marxism towards their own political camp.